welcome to Canonical, the podcast that takes literature out of the classroom. I am James Shao, and with me are my co-hosts Iad Darris and Sam Spieler.
Hey.
Hello.
Hey. Today we are wrapping up our discussion of Never Let Me Go, Rodham, and Lincoln in the Bardo. These books were part of our series Alternate Histories, Alternate Realities. Next week, join us for a special show where we have a wrap-up discussion where we talk about creating a new canon and our plans for the future. If you'd like to chat with us, you can find us on social media at CanonicalPod and on Reddit at rCanonicalPod. So, I'd like to start with a recent canonical tradition. Did you know there is an award for alternate history fiction?
No, I did not.
No.
What do they call it?
It is called the Sidewise Award.
Ugh.
Yeah, I think it's named after either a short story or a novella or something with Sidewise in the title. It was started in 1995, and they are still going strong. Most recently, I'm looking at a list of winners. Shaban has won for his Yiddish Policeman Union novel, which was very good. Underground Airlines won in 2016. That's a book that I considered for this. It's like the Underground Railroad, but with planes. But most recently, Laurent Benet won for Civilizations. That was in 2021. And in their short form category, Alan Small won for Gunpowder Treason in Tales from Alternate Earths, which is an anthology about alternate realities and alternate histories. So yeah, this award, I wish I'd known about earlier. I could have used it to help choose more books. But I got to read Ishiguro, so I was happy. But yeah, this is a very popular topic now. Sidewise Award, worth checking out, I suppose.
I mean, I would be curious what their criteria are, because I wonder if Lincoln in the Bardo is in the running for a Sidewise Award, or for that matter, if Never Let Me Go is in the running. Might be good enough for the Nobel, but not for the Sidewise.
I am looking at their past winners, and neither are on the list. Philip Roth is on the list for Plot Against America. And as I mentioned, Shaban is on the list for Yiddish Policeman's Union.
Okay.
See, the thing is, they are an alternate history award, but they are not an alternate reality award.
Yeah.
Is that what makes the difference? Is that what lets Never Let Me Go into the mix?
Well, honestly, that is in the Wikipedia page for Never Let Me Go. If you read the blurb, something like it's a dystopian alternate reality novel. I think that is the first paragraph of its Wikipedia entry. So that's what allowed me to pick it anyway, when I was trying to decide what book to read. Sam, any thoughts about the Sidewise?
No, I'm just thankful that Iad let us shoehorn in our own ideas about this, the way he likes to subvert other people's.
mean, I'm happy with both of these novels. Don't get me wrong. They are good novels, but I feel like you guys didn't get the memo as far as what I had in mind. Now,
Well,
we can talk more about it, but I feel like you've gone with the big tent school of alternate history, alternate realities.
I think the problem was including alternate realities. If you just had alternate history, I would have been out of luck. I think Ishiguro definitely does not fit under alternate history.
Well, I think the problem is probably that I wanted to read Lincoln in the Bardo, and so we tried to make it work, and then that created the big tent idea.
And then, in fact, you were the one who was the least happy with it, so it was kind of a Pyrrhic win for you.
Yeah.
The funny thing here for me is I'm actually really into alternate history, but this was your pick, Yed. I didn't have any say in it. It wasn't like I incepted you into picking this. Like, this is your pick all the way. So in some ways, I guess I was happy with it, but, I was just along for the ride, and I enjoyed the ride, even though it wasn't really alternate history. I did end up doing some research about alternate history, and the first alternate history novel, any guesses as to the language? You won't get it, I don't think, unless you've researched this.
Urdu. I don't know.
Widely considered to be the book about what if Napoleon had won.
Yeah.
It's a French book, French novel. Did you come across this yet?
I did come across that one. I didn't guess because I thought it would steal your thunder, but I read an article by a scholar, Catherine Gallagher, who mentioned that quite heavily.
Yeah, if you widen the parameters of my question to not just fiction but nonfiction, historians have been writing a lot of alternate history dating back to probably the Greek and Roman times, because I think there's a very famous essay about Alexander the Great and if he had not died. So I bring this up because I think what's interesting to me is alternate history now is almost widely accepted as something that is not just a literary subgenre, but something that might possibly be true. And true in the sense like this is how the world works, true in the sense that you have gravity and you have quantum mechanics, and they're one and the same in terms of how truthful they are. I think people actually believe that there are multiverses. And this stems from the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics. And I am not a physicist, so I can't really explain it to you.
Not going to stop you from trying.
Well, I'm just going to say the basic idea is in quantum mechanics, it matters whether or not something is observed. And when things are observed, they start being defined. And when things are not observed, they are undefined. And that's a very shallow definition of it. But with that idea that things can be both one thing and another until they're observed, you have, for example, Schrodinger's cat, which is both alive and dead until it's observed. It frees up people to understand the idea of a multiverse, because if things can happen at random, these micro decisions or whatever, or things at the quantum level change at random, then you create all these timelines that kind of spiderweb out. And it creates this idea of a multiverse. So this is the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics. The problem is that even though it's kind of widely accepted now, partly due to like superhero movies and time travel movies and Star Trek and all that, it's not actually as widely agreed upon as like gravity. You know, people don't even consider this to be really a theory the way gravity is a theory. Some people would say it's an interpretation. The guy who originated this idea, I think his name is Everett, I want to say, a physicist from the 50s. I mean, he's someone who would say it's a theory. A lot of other physicists would say it's just an interpretation. And, you know, it gets very technical as to why they don't believe it, why it's just crap in their opinion. So I think that's interesting, though, because we kind of widely accept it now in pop culture that this is true. We also come to understand alternate history books as something that's more feasible, perhaps, than science fiction. Even though it does have to do with science fiction, it is something that becomes more believable because people tell you, yeah, this could happen, you know? Like in Rodham, for example, where Hillary divorced Bill Clinton. I mean, it didn't happen. But in pop culture, someone very easily could have said, well, in another world or in another universe, this probably did happen, right? It seems to lend some kind of credence to this idea. Do you guys feel the same way? That it seems like because of this many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics that people generally are more accepting of alternate histories and alternate realities?
It kind of changes the need for this type of fiction because when we talk about Rodham, if we believe in our minds and our hearts that there is a universe out there where Hillary Clinton won the 2016 election and became the president, that changes our desire to read about it in fiction because we believe that it's actual somewhere else. For me, I don't think it matters much. I think that even if there is no possibility for other timelines, the desire to look at history in this way still remains.
Yeah. And I don't know how that sort of thing should affect our decisions. I think it's an interesting thing to think about and to consider, but I'm more interested in how does that affect one's decisions here, since you can only have it one way. This idea that your exact equal can choose a different path seems like an interesting thought exercise, but that's it. You still have to do your own observation. And once you observe whatever decision you make, the decision is already made. You still have to live in this single reality, regardless of whether there actually is an alternate reality or multiple alternate realities out there.
I think one of the more interesting philosophical questions that rise from this is this question that, you know, what they're saying is because of quantum mechanics, so many things happen that every possibility occurs, but it overlooks the idea of probability, which is what one of the criticisms of this idea is. Like, what if you're someone who's predisposed toward alcoholism, let's say? Like, yeah, there are universes where you don't become an alcoholic, but there are perhaps many more universes where you do. This idea of probability is pretty interesting because when you're talking about Hillary and what happened and how she ended up with Bill, I feel like we just assume because it has happened that she is someone who's predisposed to marrying someone like Bill, right? And that's the aspect of alternate history that I think is really interesting. This predisposition that in our world, this happens because we are predisposed to these decisions. It's not random, like a 50-50 chance, the way we think of that Schrodinger's cat, where the cat has a 50% chance of living or dying.
Wouldn't you be able to argue the opposite, though, too? That in this reality, we have these predispositions, but maybe that's only true for this reality.
That, I would say, is true because the predisposition is based off of all of these other contingencies that are based
Right.
off of our timeline.
Right.
And as far as I understand it, every possible change creates a new timeline.
Right.
So there are an infinite amount of other changes that could have taken place prior to whatever predisposition we're talking about that would obviate it.
I think that only makes sense if you understand, and once again, none of us are physicists, but you understand that at the quantum level, it's a pure 50% chance. You're saying there's no predisposition anywhere. And this is also assuming that alternate realities exist, right? Because what if they don't exist and there are predispositions? We are assuming they exist because I think we live in a society that takes it for granted that this is how the universe is, that there are multiverses and such. But if there are no multiverses, which a lot of physicists still believe, then things happen with perhaps a kind of predisposition.
I don't know if you're right about this kind of cultural landscape. I think that it's true that there's lots of multiverse fiction out there, but I don't think that's because a lot of lay people have an idea about quantum mechanics. I think that there's a lot of this fiction out there just because a lot of people think it's fun to talk about.
Yeah, I think it is fun to talk about since we are talking about it now. I think what it has done is it's primed the pump for the common person to accept a multiverse show, whereas even 20 years ago, if Star Trek did like a second timeline, a guy with a beard, in the case of like 60 years ago in the original Star Trek, like that was kind of mind-bending and people were like, I don't get it. Like, why are there two Spocks? Like, people would be legitimately confused. Whereas now, the average person who watches that episode would be like, oh, this trope again? Like, I think there is an attitude shift in how acceptable this idea of a multiverse is. But what I want to go to here, though, is I want to think about Never Let Me Go, because one of the big changes is there is this cloning development. But what's more interesting to me is in that world, in that alternate reality of Never Let Me Go, people accept that this is the right thing to do ethically. And that to me is the change, the big change. It's not the development of cloning, it's this change in attitude. Like, do you think in our world that this is something people would accept?
I think it's possible. I don't have a problem with that. I think that we would prefer not to. Like, we would prefer to have lab grown organs rather than to grow 20-year-old people and harvest from them. but people justified slavery to themselves in some way because it suited them. So I think that people would do whatever suited them at the time.
Yeah, I was about to bring up slavery as a good counterexample, that we already live in a timeline where we've done some pretty terrible things. So, what's one more on the table?
It's hard for me to say whether or not one is worse than the other, but it seems to me the idea of creating a person just to kill them and harvest their organs, there's something about that that is different from enslaving a person.
Yes, it's not exactly the same, sure. But I don't think they are complete opposites either.
And not just that, but the idea that slavery, when it was enacted, for example, in the US, was acceptable in the South, but was not acceptable in other parts of the country. There were abolitionists, even, in the 1700s. But we are presented with this world in Never Let Me Go, where there are not really abolitionists. Like we talked about in the last episode, people are not saying that there should not be donors. They're just saying we should treat them better.
I think what's missing from the discussion, though, is there's an asymmetry between how much we know about our world and how much we know about the world of that novel. We don't know the extent of their desire for organs.
This is like a brain.
It tastes
thing,
really
right?
good.
Like, do they have
Brains.
more organ failure than we do? Is it more of a pressing concern? In that case, I could say, yeah, if they needed organs badly, that would be why they were willing to do so much more than we potentially would. But because Ishiguro leaves it vague, we don't know.
I would argue, it is vague, but maybe they need them less than we do. Because as I brought up before, it seems like a very inefficient way of harvesting organs.
I'll put you on the spot here, Iad. Do you think that there's something essentially human that would make a person think, okay, this is just wrong and icky and I am not on board, no matter what alternate reality? Because if you change things too much, humans are no longer humans, right? Like at some point, you think humans believe in, treating other humans a certain way. Like, is there a line that gets drawn here where once you cross that line, it's like, well, this is not a human anymore. It's another species, right?
Yeah, I think what you're getting at is like human nature. Like, is there an alternate timeline where human nature is different? And I would say that the things that I count as human nature are pretty slim. Like, I think most people want to care for offspring. So if there was some development in an alternate timeline where people would have their offspring and not care for them, then I would say that those people are so fundamentally different that perhaps they are no longer humans. They're no longer recognizably human. But that, to me, I think is a very, very narrow definition of human nature. I think that most behaviors like cloning are acceptable in many timelines.
Yeah, I was picturing this image of if we were a species that, gave birth and immediately left our child to fend for itself, or just left in the care of a stranger. And like we had people dedicated to raise them as, younglings or whatever, but we as parents didn't care for them. That feels fundamentally different, especially in the case of just complete abandonment. That seems very different from what I recognize as human. So at that point, yeah, maybe we get to a point where we can have this discussion as feeling ethical, but then we're not talking about human nature anymore.
I also think that the important factor is whether or not we would want to read this in a novel. Because in my understanding of like the multiverse or these many worlds, all of these things are possible. But what makes it interesting to read about is that we can recognize something of our timeline in it. And because that's what makes it interesting as a work of fiction, that's why we have this limitation. But the limitation is not really part of the structure of the universe. It's just more to do with our tastes for what we like to read.
So, what if we now shift to Lincoln in the Bardo? The big change for me in that book is the existence of this Bardo, right? Even though it's not really a Bardo, it's this kind of, I don't know how you would describe it, this purgatory. It's a bit different because that world, Lincoln in the Bardo, very well could be our world, but we just can't see it. So, in that kind of reading, it's not really an alternate reality. It could very well be our reality, but we can't perceive it. That's possible. But if we do read it as an alternate reality, are there any issues with believability?
What do you mean?
Well, the question I raised before, is there something fundamental in that world that's different from how we exist as people in our world? Lincoln in the Bardo, for me, I'd say is less fundamentally different, or the characters in that book are less fundamentally different than Never Let Me Go, because it seems like it could just be our world, but with a layer over it.
I guess so, but I would say the natural laws governing the world in Lincoln and the Bardo are fundamentally different from what we understand. So, yes, maybe it's just this extra layer that we're not seeing, this supernatural layer, but it is supernatural. It is something that, at very most, some of us believe in something similar like that, that ghosts exist.
Yeah.
But I would say, a significant number do not.
Is it believable?
I mean, in the way that an alternate reality that maybe we can access is believable. But in the case of an alternate reality that we can't access, that's what we have now. So, no, not really.
I just want to note that there are books in this kind of subgenre called alternate cosmos. That's what one of my favorite resources, SF Encyclopedia, calls it, where in these alternate cosmos, fundamental laws of the world are different.
Alternate cosmos, that's like when you have, what's his face, Carl Sagan in one side, but you have
Kramer on the other.
No. What's the guy that does the Cosmos show now?
Neil deGrasse Tyson?
Yeah, there you go.
I'm just guessing. That seems like something that asshole would do.
Alternate Cosmos. That's it. I like Kramer, though. Cosmo Kramer. Good.
Well, just as an example of an alternate cosmos is a classic sci-fi story, Philip Jose Farmer's Sail On, which initially seems to be, I'm just reading off of SF Encyclopedia, initially seems to be about Columbus's voyage as an alternate history, but then you find out, spoiler alert, that it's an entirely different cosmos. The stars are all different, and the world is different. It's like a different world that they exist in, not just a different history. So you're saying that this layering of ghosts is a different reality or a different world. But could it not be our world, but we just can't perceive these ghosts?
Sure, but
That's the end of my cross-examination.
I mean, it kind of doesn't matter until we can perceive it.
Yes.
I think that for me, the important question is to what degree a fictional text creates a picture of the world. Because we might look at Lincoln in the Bardo and we might say that this is the same as our world, except for these specific things that Saunders has described. But another way of thinking about a picture of the world is it creates a system of rules for how this world works, and then there are many other differences possible that are just undescribed by Saunders. If that's the case, it becomes less believable in terms of your question, but I still don't have a problem with it. I could believe either version of it.
Yeah, I don't have a problem with it either. I just think it's interesting to think about because this is, for me, one of the more important issues when you're reading an alternate history is what is the difference? And what the author perceives as a fundamental difference, I think that's interesting. That gets to sort of the inner workings of that author's mind.
I mean, to get back to shitting on you two, This is the problem that I had with both of your picks, is that these books are alternate reality in the sense that every work of fiction is alternate reality. Like, you could write the most realistic novel possible, but if it's about a person who doesn't exist, that's the one piece that makes it an alternate reality. Or if it's about Sam where he's 5'7" instead of 5'8", that's an alternate reality. But it's not what people latch on to alternate reality for.
Well, if we're taking turns to shit on each other, then what I would say is the least interesting of the three is Rodham, because in Rodham, despite it fitting the definition of alternate history, there's really no difference. Like, there's no fundamental difference. The only difference is she chooses not to marry Bill. If we view it through this prism of what is the difference in these worlds, that is easily, for me, the least interesting difference. Because really, there's no difference. It's just, as I described, a real person fiction. It's fan fiction.
I think the problem I have, not to say that Rodham is as good a novel as the other two, but it's not the nature of the story that makes it bad. It's just that Sittenfeld is not a particularly inventive writer. She is not going for something particularly interesting. I think that Ishiguro and Saunders are much more interesting than she is. But I think that it could be more interesting, not in spite of that limitation, but because of that limitation. Because it's very directly engaged with our world, but it differs in one specific and important way. It has what I've heard described as a nexus. It has one point where you have a left turn, and then you could have many other left turns that follow from the first turn. And that would be interesting. I think the problem is that there's one left turn and then maybe two or three others. But really what you would want is you would want to see like 20 new turns opening up. Like in the first episode in the series, I said, what I like about alternate history is the way that we see history kind of cascade. Different choices creating other choices.
Yeah, I mean, my feeling about alternate history is similar in some ways because I think it's related to this idea of high concept sci-fi. I like high concept sci-fi. Once again, to define it, high concept sci-fi is science fiction that is primarily focused on some idea and less focused on perhaps character development or storytelling or whatever. The problem is alternate histories, it's a very fertile ground for high concept sci-fi, right? Like, for example, that Columbus thing. What if Christopher Columbus sailed on an entirely different world? Whoa. Or what if the Germans won? Whoa. Or what if there are these like Jewish policemen in Alaska, I think was the Yiddish Policemen's Union. I read the book a long time ago. I mean, that's high concept. That's the important part of reading alternate history. And then you have what I say is a middling concept of like, what if Hillary didn't marry Bill? It's like, for me, it's kind of like, yeah, I see what you're going for, like I get it, but this high concept was not very ambitious, it's like, it's middling concept, not sci-fi.
In terms of whether or not we should appreciate alternate history in terms of what it can imagine about the potential future or potential alternate world, I think it's interesting to look at Catherine Gallagher and her work. I mentioned her a little bit earlier, but she has done a lot of research on alternate history. And she writes that a major appeal of alternate history is the opportunity it offers us to judge history, not really to think about possibilities that have not happened in a very abstract alternate world, but rather possibilities that have not happened in a way that is very close to our world, the way that Rodham is very close to our world. So why do people want to judge history in that way? Why is that meaningful? Does it serve any kind of moral purpose, or does it help us learn something about history?
I think that in the most basic sense, people want to be proven right, like a sort of confirmation bias. if we're looking at just the judgment aspect of that question. It appeals to our sense of wanting to be right about our own actions and choices. Like, especially in the case like Rodham, we talked about how self-selecting that readership is, but that allows a certain segment of readers to say, see, it could have been this way. It could have gone this much better way, even though, as we discussed, it's kind of the same.
I think it serves a number of functions, but all of them quite basic. For example, I think it allows us to retain a kind of moral superiority because a lot of fiction that was written post Civil War, post World War II, were about, like, what if the Confederates had won? And then it shows you how terrible life would have been if the Confederates did win the Civil War. Or what if the Nazis won? Then it shows you, like, how terrible life would be if the Nazis won. And it just serves to reinforce this kind of optimism that we are on the right track because we are the moral people and we deserve to win. A lot of fiction historically was like that. But, in more recent times, when you have a more problematic postmodern view of history, you then get a different kind of alternate history where they end up becoming more positive relative to our life. It becomes like we should have done things this way, not that way. But it ends up being the same kind of message, which is that we are either morally superior or morally inferior. It's a very basic way of understanding a fundamental change in history.
Yeah, even in those cases where you have a depiction of us losing out because we made certain decisions, showing a reality that is better than ours is, showing that we made the wrong decisions. Even if you're saying we are morally inferior in that way, the people writing that are saying that they are morally superior.
So to your question, though, yeah, I mean, following up on what you're saying as well, Sam, that yes, I think it does have moral and didactic use. And in fact, it might be one of the primary uses of this kind of fiction, that it reinforces what we believe to be true.
I think that there is a sense that I get from this kind of fiction that it might be not as high-minded as we might like to think it is. And what people get out of it is just the sense of, well, this is different from what you know. Crazy, right? It's a very simple understanding of fiction. And maybe this is the wrong way of talking about it, but I guess you could say that there's an aesthetic way of appreciating fiction and enjoying it, and then there's a cognitive way. And if you are reading something and enjoying it cognitively, you are thinking carefully about the ideas. But with this kind of fiction, I think it's just this base satisfaction where it's different, and that difference is enough to excite you. Or, like what Sam said, it's the confirmation bias. You think you're right, the book shows you you're right, it's just kind of a pat on the back. This is a problem with Rodham especially. I wonder, though, about a novel like The Man in the High Castle. I think that whenever this kind of fiction gets good, it might need to move away from our real lives only because our human nature is so often to gratify ourselves. Like Sam, you had mentioned that we want this confirmation bias, but why do we want it? Do we create these novels because we are having some sort of crisis of confidence?
I think often we do have this crisis of confidence, as you say. But in the case of Rodham, I mean, how did you put it? You diagnosed Rodham in an interesting way in one of those episodes. Now I can't think of how.
Frustrated Democrat fan fiction?
Yeah, I guess that is what I'm looking for. It's the Democrats that are frustrated with how things turned out. And it's not just a pat on the back. It's also like a skewer saying it could have been better. But we were also talking about how in that book, we get a Hillary that is fundamentally the same while still trying to show us that she's fundamentally different. I think even if we just focus on this moral use, it feels really unstable to me. It feels like something, I won't say pointless, but it doesn't seem very useful.
So, another interesting part of Gallagher's article is that she notes that alternate history fiction has become incredibly more common in our time, especially since the 1990s. And, perhaps as James had said, this has something to do with our understanding of quantum mechanics, but is there any other reason or any other way to account for this being more popular?
I think we're a lot more judgmental outwardly. Well, maybe not. I don't know that we're more judgmental, but I think the way media works today and the way we are connected today allow us to be more judgmental outwardly and to share those opinions. I think politically, at least in the US, there's a pretty large divide right now. And so that gives us this sense of wanting to see things from different angles, see how things could be or how things would have been had, one little change happened.
For me, I don't think it's necessarily related to judgment. I think I would attribute it much more to postmodern thought becoming widely accepted. And part of that is, of course, quantum mechanics. But how we talk about reality now is so fundamentally different from, 30 years ago. You can pick any TV show, like look at the most popular shows in the 80s. I mean, how many of them dealt with alternate realities, right? Like, what was really popular in the 80s? I don't remember. Was it Home Improvement? Was that late 80s?
That's 90s.
I mean, yeah, but even then, that's more recent than the 80s, right? What was, I don't even know what was most popular in the 80s.
Wonder Years?
Sure, something like that. Compare that to Stranger Things, I mean, it's just the way we accept and view the world is fundamentally different. And I don't know if it has to do with judgment necessarily.
I mean, Twilight Zone was a thing that existed
Yes.
long before.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
And similar shows. There were a bunch of knockoff Outer Limits.
Yeah. But the sheer, I mean, and Sliders, of course, that was 80s, right? 70s, 80s? I don't remember.
90s.
90s
Oh,
also.
well, there you go. That's also more recent than I thought. But it's just the sheer volume, I think, of these shows now. And it's gone from niche. Like, people didn't get together to watch Sliders, right? Sliders was something the nerds watched. Everyone watches Stranger Things. I mean, I guess it's still probably primarily male, but I mean, it's got a huge reach, much more popular than a show like Sliders. I just think that we've moved toward a more postmodern world and a postmodern understanding of the world.
I think that it's the idea that people had in the past, and it is about judging history. It's that we live in maybe not, as they say, the best of all possible worlds, but that we are living in a very good world. And our media saturation at the moment is reinforcing the idea that, in fact, our world is not very good. And perhaps if there is a multiverse out there, we are living in one of the worst possible worlds. And therefore, there is more of a critical impulse now than there was in the past. But I don't know if it's really something that people are aware of. I mean, when you critique culture, there's always the sense that things are happening because of ideology or happening subconsciously at a level that people aren't aware of when they're creating and consuming. I really think, though, that at the base level that people are aware of, they just think it's fun. It's just a trend. It doesn't have deeper intellectual roots than that.
On that note, we'll wrap it up. Thank you for listening. If you thought we were off base with our understanding of quantum mechanics, let us know on Reddit or on social media at CanonicalPod. If you enjoyed this podcast, you can give us a review on Apple or your podcast platform of choice. Next week, we'll be back to talk about our podcast. Till next time, Happy reading. We'll talk to you then.